welcome to the Red Kelly Cast. This podcast is sanctioned by Mark McGowan, and this week we're talking about art under capitalism. I am your host, Moff, joined by Jackie and Colton, your other hosts.
Hello.
Yo!
Hi. I'm getting a submarine because of this podcast.
I'm so upset.
As in our previous recording, which didn't go through, Colton asked a very important and a very long-winded question, which is, what is art?
Yep.
We could spend all day on that question, but
We won't.
We won't, no. Rest assured.
Yeah, you can figure that out yourself.
Yes, so the one thing that we all agree on as Marxist-Leninists is that art is classist, and it serves the ruling class ideology and reflects it. Even if an artist's initial thought is anti-state and anti-status quo, that does not mean that that is how art will be interpreted. That does not equate to how its messaging will be conveyed publicly, because it is not in the hands of the artist in a capitalist system, and not even just in a capitalist system, but there are also examples of other historical periods.
under feudalism, of course, art was bought and paid for by nobility and church. In the classical period, it was patronized by for Rome old patricians and wealthy people of their state. And yeah, throughout all these eras, we see it reflect the ruling class ideology and enforce it.
Yeah, and this just is kind of just a logical conclusion for the function of art and how it operates. You know, like it's not so much a product of a system, but an inevitable byproduct of any society. And what tends to happen is all art that kind of survives history and time is art that the state permissions to flourish and the state gives permission to have influence. So, you know, your what's the word I'm looking for? Underground, subversive. Your subversive movements tend to get lost in history because, yeah, once again, the state wouldn't allow those things to happen.
It's an inconvenience.
Yeah.
Although we do see some things picked up by different other historical periods which pick and choose which movements align with their ideology better and reinvest in it and revive it.
It's important to note, when we say pick and choose, we're not saying that every single state has always had like a ministry, people like looking over all the art in a quite a literal sense and picking like, okay, we'll support this, we won't support this. We're talking about a system that really doesn't need to think for itself. These things occur
Organically.
They occur organically through the system of like the art that is successful under capitalism is the art that is profitable.
Yeah, absolutely. One could say it's a dialectical relationship. One can say that. One could say, yeah. I mean, in case you haven't noticed, we are Marxist-Leninists, so be prepared for the word dialectical. Might throw in a cheeky basic superstructure every now and then, but we'll see how we go. But yeah, one could say it's a dialectical relationship, that if there's a message that resonates with the populace, that has a relationship with the way that a state operates and the concessions that a state has to make, or the movements a state has to appropriate in order to pacify the masses, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And although Moth mentioned capitalism, this was also, in a way, different under, say, socialist Soviet Union, whereas the state did actually sponsor art projects and did actually sponsor many of the founding fathers of contemporary art, such as the beginning of all film schools began in the Soviet Union, which was actually state regulated. But the censorship was very different to that of capitalism, which we'll be talking about in more detail today.
Capitalism is not so free and liberal in that it doesn't use censorship because it is the right thing to do or the liberal and freedom-loving thing to do. It doesn't use censorship to the obvious and clear extent of a state saying, we will not allow this kind of art, we will crack down on you and send the police after you. Yeah. It doesn't need to use that kind of censorship, because it already has the economic censorship of all countercultural art. Truly revolutionary art under capitalism it will have its day, it can be allowed to exist, but it will not survive, and it will not be anywhere near as successful as art that does not say anything or has been recuperated.
Yeah, because the only virtue of capitalism is profit. So if art equals profit, then art will survive, and if it doesn't, then it won't.
And I think a good example of it is, I'm sorry anyone Gen Z will be going back to the 90s and pretending like that's a relevant example. But of course it's not an exception, but I think it's a very bright phenomenon that kind of resonates with many ages.
Yeah.
And that's Cobain, and that's the band Nirvana, which was supposed to be something of a rebellious, generational voice meant for protest against the music industry of that time and against authority. But what it became was completely different to the author's intent. Instead of being a riot against MTV, it actually reinforced its value and actually reinstalled it in society.
Yeah.
Unfortunately and fortunately for Kurt Cobain and for Nirvana, nothing does as well on MTV as a protest against MTV.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's interesting to note, like, at the same time, we all know the Che Guevara t-shirt phenomenon occurred and things like that. And, yeah, it's a cycle that repeats itself. We have a movement that resonates with younger people. This could be something that could be turned into a product. It gets turned into a product, it gets milked for all it's worth, and then they look for another... capitalism. I'm not super conspiratorial to say that there are a group of people looking this out. But capitalism, another rebellious movement presents itself, and then the cycle continues and the profit continues from that. And that's kind of the relationship that art has with capitalism, especially the ones that we're talking about. We'll get into, the more bougie things like fine art and stuff like that later, but when we're thinking of subversive art, it becomes part of the system. And it's a tragedy, and a really ironic tragedy, that we see occurring over and over again. I think of things like genres in hip-hop, I think of things like drill and trap music. These are products of very very dissociated economic situations. And they themselves become a product of capitalism and used and exploited almost to a degree to make profits for people.
You like jazz?
Yeah, you like jazz. Yeah, exactly. And a more historical example would be something like jazz, yeah.
If you hear that in the cut, know that I fought. I fought to get that cut. I tried, but...
What do you mean by jazz, though? What does that have to do with anything?
Oh, wow, okay. All right, okay. Children's channel. Oh, I wonder what that means. All right. What does that mean? Well, essentially emphasizing on what Colton was saying earlier, we have a movement that was supposed to be empowering some people that were slaves, the black movement of America, that was under severe living conditions. And that being stolen from them, interpreted into a whole different movement without acknowledging its roots, or at least forgetting its roots a lot of the time. And that actually spanned into contemporary rock and roll. That was the beginning of America's music, to be honest. And it came from severe, horrible exploitation.
No, absolutely. It's just such a vivid example just of how soulless liberalism and capitalism is that they have to resort to appropriating and stealing the subversive content against them to actually make something meaningful and that actually resonates with people.
Now, what we've been dancing around is something that's been occurring in capitalism for as long as it's existed. For when it comes across art that it recognizes as some kind of threat, that it has some power to it, it recuperates it and makes it part of the spectacle. For recuperation, we have Debord to thank from this. Yep. In his Society of the Spectacle, he says, official culture is a rigged game where conservative powers forbid subversive ideas to have direct access to the public discourse. Such ideas get first trivialized, they get weakened, and sterilized, cleaned up. And then they are safely incorporated back within mainstream society where they can be exploited to add new flavors to old dominant ideas.
Recuperation. I mean, it's pretty much encapsulates what me and Jackie were talking about. And, you know, it has other terms. A lot of us could think of things like appropriation and things like that. But, yeah, it's just a form of... No, I'll leave it at that. I was going to say I completely lost my word.
It's a form of capitalism's continued destruction of everything that makes humans special.
Yeah.
Aww.
Everything.
Yeah.
All of it.
Okay.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, your expression and your ideas and you yourself as a person, you are a product. And you can be bought, you can be sold, and you can be produced.
And this extends not just to art, but also to artists.
Yeah, exactly. Artists in and of themselves. And that's where it's never been more clear than now, that occurring, you know? I think of the artist, I don't know, Doja Cat. Like her music, she's cool, but her as a person, her Instagram feed, her TikToks, those are what sell her as well. It's... Yeah.
And I think in terms of sort of countercultural ideas, there's a really interesting quote, which also I think is a great example. It's a quote by Mark Fisher in his book Capitalist Realism, which I think is a good read for understanding art in capital society. We won't recommend it as extremely based because I personally haven't read it in full detail, but I think it has some very valid points.
Yeah. Whenever we quote a book, we should quickly give it a scale of 1 to 10 on how base it is, so people know what and what not to read. Yeah. Mark DeBoer, solid 8.
Solid 8.
Yeah.
I'd say 8.5. 8.5. After a few drinks, a good solid 9.2. But this one, the quote is really interesting because it reflects sort of what we were talking about Cobain, and I think we'll talk about Banksy.
Yeah.
Sorry, there is a running joke of which I will have to now explain.
You don't need to. It's fine.
Okay. So if I say Banksy at some stage, it's because my first language happens to be in Cyrillic writing and with a heavy accent. So yes, my apologies if that does slip through. The quote is, "Alternative and independent don't designate something outside of the mainstream culture, rather they are styles, in fact dominant styles within the mainstream." So what we think of as rebellious, if we're talking about, say, Rage Against the Machine or Rammstein, or non-musical examples because we just have seemed to use musical examples for no particular reason, they do seem rebellious, but that is part of overall commodification of contemporary art, and that is also part of its commercialization, which is an inevitable trait within capitalism and art surviving in a capitalist landscape. If we look at, for example, Banksy and his graffiti art, the initial idea behind having art as graffiti is that it is impossible to sell and pull apart, but ironically enough, they would pull that down, they would take it down from the walls and manage to sell it anyway. And now that is a question of, does an artist actually own his work, his or her or their work under capitalism? And I will leave that as rhetorical because I think we know the answer to that. And another quote by someone. Where is it from? This is another Mark Fisher quote, which also I think is a great interpretation of our subject at hand here. "Here even success meant failure, since to succeed would only mean that you were the new meat on which the system could feed." So even when Banksy would later protest against his works being displayed, in one of the examples, The Girl with the Balloon, he would shred the work apart after it was sold for millions. Even that was part of the spectacle.
Yeah, in that example, we see that piece of art became more valuable after that because it has now had this publicity stunt, or what would be called a publicity stunt, added to it. It's now had this stunt added to it. He tries to make his work public by putting it on walls. He hides his identity to make it so like, oh, these things shouldn't matter, and also so he doesn't have to market his image in that kind of way, and he can actually have some privacy, which most modern artists, as soon as they get big enough, they do not get that anymore.
Yeah, what you were mentioning though, yeah, sure, we could say that's for privacy and stuff like that, but all of that is part of the product though. Like, you know, you look at the example of Banksy, there's actually, he was showing that if he sold his art on the streets and didn't sign his name to it, no one would buy it, because the image that he produced is just as important as the artistic work itself, essentially.
It's part of his protest.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he's thought up some very clever ways of protesting the system, and even so, it still all gets co-opted as part of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He shows off that the people, by and large, do not buy his art off the street if he does not show it to Banksy. He sells the same art, or the same art gets sold in the case of these pieces that were spray painted to the walls and then just taken down with, I doubt any consent on his part.
Well, it's also, we use the word spectacle with intent. We're also referring to the Society of the Spectacle and that theory behind that, which the board wrote about significantly. It's the fact that this not only applies to art. Art is just one of the reflections of where we can see this, but this is against any kind of social political campaigns that we see. We no longer associate something with its objective value or its inherent value. We associate it with the spectacle around it.
Whatever disarms you and makes you whatever disarms you and stops you from thinking about the world and removes your class consciousness or weakens it, that is part of the spectacle. Everyone has something they are weak to in part of the spectacle. There is sports, there's TV, there is politics. Mm-hmm. All this is part of the spectacle.
And politics, primarily one of the main focuses. It is easier for us within the Society of the Spectacle to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism. And that kind of brings us to the idea of, well, not that specifically, but elaborating on our ideas around the commercialization. We haven't actually talked about the art market and the aspect of art as an investment.
Yeah, that's just a whole nother world, like
tax evasion.
Just a little peek into that world.
Yeah.
Here's a quote that I'll throw in by Robert Hughes, which is one of the art critics. The price of a work of art is now part of its function. Its new job is to sit on the wall and get more expensive. It's no longer a property of humankind the way a book is. Art becomes a particular property of someone who can afford it. So, in other words, and this is me speaking now, part of capital and part of wealth generation.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like real estate now, you know, something that was originally meant to be shelter for a person is now a liquid asset to be speculated on. And as I alluded to earlier by saying it's a whole different world, like this is only reserved for a very certain class of person who could afford to get into it. And with that comes all sorts of things like, you know, notions of money laundering and tax evasion and things like that, and using these pieces as a means or a mechanism to do those sorts of things.
And then art loses its inherent value.
Yeah,
art loses the integrity and the messaging in which the artist put forth. It no longer matters. Some of these things we will never be able to see as part of the working class.
Yeah.
It will be hidden away from
all
us.
the rebellious parts of art, or part of a piece of art, all the parts of its message, everything about that becomes a piece of trivia that the capitalist owning it, or whoever is holding it or saying something to some collector or curator, can spew out without thought, or just say, oh, this is quite a special one. This guy was actually a communist, you see. Very shocking. Yeah. This artist was so-and-so, this artist believed these things. It becomes part of a trivia to increase the wealth and the prestige of the piece, with absolutely nothing to do with the people that created it or any thought of art belonging to mankind, humanity, excuse me.
Alternatively, the part that is inconvenient is forgotten about, like in Picasso's case, where a lot of elitists, a lot of the bourgeois seem to be huge fans of Picasso's work against war and all those abstract messaging, but they seem to forget that he was a part of the Communist Party, and that he actually wrote that being part of the Communist Party is a logical consequence of his entire life work. And it just made complete sense that this is a continuation of his messaging. And I think that kind of feeds into another interesting topic, which is, can art under capitalism be meaningful?
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah,
It is, like, it is, and it will be, and it always will be, but it's, you know, you use the term meaningful, but we look at art and, you know, we think, okay, the worst thing you could do under capitalism is get an art degree or something like that. Because, yeah, what are the parameters of something being meaningful or successful or whatever? You know, if I play my basement shows to 50 people and, you know, yell and scream about Marxism and working conditions and stuff like that, and then a couple people come up to me after and say, yeah, good show, really like what you were saying up there. I mean, was that a success? Was that meaningful? I spent probably $60 in petrol money going down there, so there was no profit. There was no profit at all. But was that a success? Was that meaningful? Was that important? And I think like that's kind of what you as an individual, or we as a collective, or as a party, or as a movement have to really, really bear in mind, that we are in a system that has different goalposts than we do, and that create art for different reasons that we do. Art exists under socialism, art exists in a communist movement, but art also exists in a neoliberal movement. So yeah, when it comes to messaging and who hears it and what it does, it's, yeah, really, and I hate to say this, but it really is up to the artist what those conditions are and like what the benchmarks are.
Is it up to the artist, or is it up to who draws the benchmarks though? Because an artist can have, I think maybe we should twist this into more so not about the artist setting a benchmark, but whether the artist is part of a large organized movement.
Yeah.
Of if the artist is just making music separately as a side gig, or is the person actually part of a larger movement? Is the person involved? Is the person living out these ideas, or is it part of a marketing scheme?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, this, I mean, you could almost say exclusively, but I would say this especially applies to like what our ideas are and what our things are. Like we're a materialist group at the end of the day, you know. You could spew out these messages all you want, but you know, if your boots aren't on the ground actually making change, then that can only go so far.
So really we come around to saying that capitalism destroys the meaning of art. It destroys it as surely and as completely as it can. Mm-hmm. But that does not mean art does not have meaning, and it does not mean that it cannot have meaning even under capitalism.
No. And like we mentioned at the beginning, like this is not something as can it exist or will it exist. It's an inevitability. You know, it doesn't matter what country I was born in. I'm pretty sure I would have still been making music and stuff like that. Like, it's just something that happens. And, you know, history just shows that. Like, it's existed as long as humans.
40,000 years.
Yeah, exactly. So,
at least.
Yeah.
And that's just evidence that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so how do we... Then the question becomes not whether it's meaningful anymore, because we've decided that it does have a certain meaning, but how do we beat this capitalist dominant ideology that forces its own meaning interpretation onto us? How do we as a movement still create art that has the correct messaging, or the messaging that we want? How do we own the messaging that is conveyed?
Now what you need there is, well, it's easy for me to say radical art. Many people have tried radical art. It needs to be radical, class-conscious art.
Yeah.
That has a goal of helping and organizing the working class.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and don't be naive about it, and don't think that sorry. And don't be naive about it. Like, art isn't going to lead the movement. it's going to be a worker revolution, and that's what it comes down to. It's like, hey, you want to make art under socialism, get involved and lead a socialist revolution. Like that's the vehicle that it's going to happen. Like let's be honest about this.
Just because you have radical music though doesn't mean that you are going to outplay Cobain and outplay Banksy and outplay all the other Rage Against the Machine or anyone by any means. It just means that you have to understand that there are two ways of an artist in contemporary times, and that is the one that, in the very small percentage chance that you do make it to a label, the label dictates the music that you make, and then you become a product, and you sign off yourself to become a commodity. Or you kind of live the underground life of most contemporary artists that we may or may never hear. Yeah. And that is just part of history, really.
I mean, and because, art is not special in terms of it's just like any other labor. It's something that could be co-opted, commodified, and appropriated and alienated. Not alienated. What's the term I'm looking for? And it's something that could cause an artist to be alienated from their work. Yeah.
I'd say art though is art under the contemporary means is like the highest point of intellectual work, which is almost like a luxury. Yeah, to be honest, it's a luxury to be an artist now.
Yeah, absolutely. Like our current conditions under capitalism, that does dictate who can be an artist, or I should more likely say a prominent artist kind of thing. Yeah.
The first step to being a prominent artist is being related to a prominent artist or a producer of a prominent artist.
Yeah.
And just going back to what most artists look like right now, that is sort of a reality that we have to deal with, that most of them are working part-time or full-time jobs just to be able to survive and be able to produce and sponsor their own art. And even if that is not that, but that, if anything, makes your art more meaningful because you are part of the working class. Absolutely. You understand the working class struggles and you can relate to it. And having small gigs, having that small audience, but not selling yourself out to a label, does make you invest into quality rather than quantity, which is horribly underappreciated in a capitalist system because we're not thinking about targeting some kind of financial rates.
99% of artists know that they will not be Dua Lipa, Miley Cyrus, anything like that. They will not be Ed Sheeran. But they can find other ways of being successful that do not fit the capitalist mold. If they can combine revolutionary art with revolutionary politics.
Also, memes are... Okay, I can't believe I'm saying this. I can't believe I'm saying it of all people, the most... the old soul of the podcast who hasn't participated in the meme culture in years, but memes are also something that cannot be co-opted by institutions, and therefore it is one of the most proletariat forms of art.
Yeah, memes are so absurd. They don't get it. Oh my god. Companies have tried. They don't get it.
You're right. I just can't believe this. The term the memes are the most pure form of the proletariat movement.
It is one of the most pure forms of the proletariat movement because it can't be, because even when, say, Wendy's or any other company,
when they try,
you can tell they try, but that is probably it.
That poor social media internal manager they have on that.
Oh man, I cry for their HR and I hope they get paid well.
Took some psychic damage just reading those things. Anyways, I think that's time, honestly. So we're gonna wrap it up there. And just kind of as a kind of as an outro, I would encourage you. Let's go to some basement shows and play some indie games and look at those smaller things, what's going on, and
make memes.
Make some memes. deep fry those memes, extra crispy.
The more fried, the better. Honestly.
So we'll wrap it up there. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you later.